Morning. You will hear from my accent that I'm not Australian at all. I'm British, been there for 19 years. I actually only went for 2 and forgot to go home. And my parents said to me 19 years ago, "Oh my God, you're never going to come back." And that was when I was in Chicago, having done a year there at sort of 25 years old. And I'll never forget calling my dad up and saying, a month before I was due to come home, I think, "Dad, there's an opportunity to go to Australia." And now I'm a parent, and I just heard my dad go, and he was right. I didn't. I've been there for 19 years. I live in Sydney. It's a beautiful place. If you've ever considered Australia for any other reason, it's worth just coming for the harbour and the beaches. But I am going to talk to you today about clinical research. Where is my clicker? Mobius Medical is a CRO that is in Melbourne and Sydney, headquartered in Sydney, and we've just incorporated in Singapore, which is a bit exciting for us. So is Australia worth the jet lag? It is a long way, and Grant has just flown in this morning, and I came in last night, and it is a 14-hour flight from LA to Sydney. I'm going to hopefully show you today why it is worth the jet lag, and God knows it is a jet lag-worthy place. I didn't sleep a wink last night. I was up all night. So excuse me if I fluff my words. Oh, wait. My slide didn't load. You guys, my slide didn't load. Okay. That's fine. That was my agenda slide, and what I want to do today is talk to you about 4 aspects of why Australia could be worth the jet lag for doing clinical research. The first one was our regulatory pathway, which is a notification scheme, not an approval pathway. The second one was cost effectiveness. So not only is the dollar in favour of the US, it's at 75 cents right now Australian to the dollar. There's also an incentive scheme that the Australian Tax Office offers in order to encourage overseas companies to come and actually do their R&D activity in Australia. The third thing, and because I haven't got my agenda, I'm struggling, so I'm just going to go straight onto this slide. So our regulator, Therapeutic Goods Administration, for all medical device trials, irrespective of the risk category and irrespective of the phase of development, only require a notification. So there is absolutely no time delay from a regulatory standpoint of getting a clinical trial approved in Australia. We have human research ethics committees, and we have a governance approval. There are 2 ways to skin that cat, and that depends on the private setting and the public setting in Australia, and I'm going to go into both of those things in detail in a minute. We get approval from first protocol and investigator's brochure in my hand to 4 weeks site activation in the private setting and around about 12 weeks in the public setting. And that means your patients are enrolled and your data started gathering before, in the US, we've even really submitted for an IDE, for example. An important point, though, is it's no less rigorous in Australia. We do cut corners in a lot of ways, but not in clinical research. The ethics review process is virtually the same as your IRB process. They need the same documents, and they need the same content in those documents. So a lot of people come to Australia and say, what preclinical work do I need in order to get approval to do my clinical study in Australia? And I say exactly the same as anywhere else in the world. You need to have proven that your device or your technology is as safe as it can be to go into a human being, exactly the same as anywhere else. Competent authorities in Europe, certainly in the UK, can really slow things down. And our motto, of course, is no worries, mate. So this is a timeline from protocol in the hands of my team to actually getting a clinical site activated and enrolling patients. So as you can see in the private setting, we take about 7 days to submit. Private setting ethics committee or IRB, they meet weekly, and generally you can get, as long as you meet a deadline, you can get in the next week's meeting. Within a week, they actually respond and give you their first cycle of questions. Usually we can get that, as long as you put a robust submission together, you can answer that within 24 hours. It's usually dotting I's and crossing T's in a consent form. And by about week 4, they've approved it. Once you have that approval letter, then you can submit to the private institution's governance. Now, occasionally in the private setting, that is the investigator. They're the director of their own clinic, and they sign the contract, and they sign the indemnity form, and you're good to go, because that could be same day as well as ethics committee approval. That CTN submission is our online documentation to TGA to say, we are going to do a clinical trial, we are going to use this unapproved medical device in a clinical trial setting legally. Please acknowledge the fact that we've got ethics approval and we've got contracts signed. They do that within 2 days electronically, and that acknowledgement letter goes with import permits, etc., if needed, if there's a biological component or something, with the customs documentation, and that's how you get your product into Australia. It's extremely simple. In the public setting, same process pretty much, just a little bit longer, 6 weeks to get your first cycle of questions, around about 12 to 14 weeks for your site activation. So now I wanted to talk to you about 3 case studies. I think it's sort of more relevant if I show you some of the sponsors and the clients that we work with at Mobius, who are US companies. I'll show you their technology first of all, and then a couple of advantages that they found about coming to Australia to do their research. So this is the Tendyne valve. This is a transapical valve that is inserted as such and is tethered to the base of the left ventricle. There's a mini thoracotomy, procedures done in around 25 minutes. Tendyne. I have permission to talk to you about Tendyne. So this is the company that's making this mitral valve. They're now acquired by Abbott. They chose Australia in 2014 to do their early feasibility study. And Professor David Muller in St Vincent's Hospital is a pretty globally renowned interventional cardiologist and has done a huge amount of first-in-human procedures before. Hence, they chose him. One of the crucial things, I think, when you're doing early feasibilities or first-in-human, especially risky procedures such as this, is that the site and the investigator have a very close relationship with the ethics committee. He fronted up, he talked to them, he explained that if he's comfortable to do this procedure, so should they be. And we managed to get this approved in a relatively short period of time, 2 months. And what they did was they said, okay, we're going to approve it, but we only want you to do 5 cases, and then we want to look at the safety data at 30 days. That was all good, and we ended up enrolling the 15. Other reasons that Tendyne chose Australia is, of course, we've got state-of-the-art facilities, just like the US. We've got hybrid cath labs, etc. And we had, for those first 5 anyway, we had a team of cardiothoracic surgeons in the lab ready to go if anything untoward, shall we say, happened. So the timeline now for that particular study, history, so June 2014, we got the first protocol in Australia in my hands, and by September 2014 we had approval. October we initiated the site, and then we had devices delivered in November, and they did their first patient. Same sort of time, what was happening over here was they had their pre-meeting with FDA, or they requested that, met in September, submission went in November, and then the ID was granted March 2015. And I believe a lot of that data that came out of Australia from November to March was highly supportive of that IDE. So 2014, we did our first in human in 15 patients. The protocol remains the same protocol number, and it was 1 ethics submission back in 2014. 2015, we did a protocol amendment, and we expanded that early feasibility study based on the fact that we had no safety no safety concerns whatsoever, and patients were doing extremely well. They expanded it to 110 patients and out to 25 sites in the US and in Europe. A year later, we extended the follow-up period from 2 years to 5 years on the request of FDA. And 2018 now, they're just about to release the next generation of the delivery device, and we're about to do a protocol amendment and an investigator's brochure submission to our ethics committee. They've just had their IDE for the pivotal study here in the US as well. The point of all that was that I wanted to make, throughout that whole period, there was never any interaction with TGA required. All we had to do was amend the protocol, amend the investigator's brochure, and or the instructions for use, submit to our ethics committee, and once that was approved, up you went and you started enrolling according to the protocol amendment. This is my next case. So we're still in mitral valve. Hopefully it'll start. This time it's a cinch device around the failing mitral valve as opposed to a complete prosthetic device. There is elevator music that went with this. I took it out. Maybe I should have left it in to relieve the silence. Okay, so it's deployed and the cinching happens there. Or I should say the fixation happens. It's pulled through and that cinches that valve into place. Cardiac dimensions. So this is the Carillon mitral contour system. It's CE marked now, and it's for percutaneous mitral annuloplasty. The reduced FMR study, so it was in Australia and in Europe. It was a randomized controlled clinical trial, and they enrolled 120 patients. Cardiac Dimensions chose Australia due to mainly an investment opportunity, but also to take advantage of Australia's tax incentive. They established their parent company in Australia. Their investors were Carnegie, and the company has reaped all manner of rewards, millions of dollars in rebates back from the Australian tax office. Just a little bit on the R&D tax incentive then in Australia. So this offers 2 levels of financial benefit, and it's basically determined based on the annual turnover. Less than $20 million attracts a rebate of 43.5 cents for every dollar you spend on R&D activities in Australia. Over 20 million, it's 38.5%. So you can see from the diagram that the foreign entity opens an entity in Australia, all CRO activities are refundable, all site costs are refundable according to this incentive. I've also put KPMG's details up there. I think I've been recommended this woman handle the setup of the Australian entity and the administration of the accounting by half a dozen companies now in the US. She's really getting quite a name for herself. So you'll get these slides and her information's there. I'd like to introduce Rick Whippich. He's the COO and CFO of Cardiac Dimensions, and I'm going to hopefully read this to you. He wanted to actually send a video, but he said, I don't like my voice on recording. And I said, none of us like our voices on recording, but anyway, we'll read it. So he said, our decision to base our randomized double-blind controlled trial of the Carillon mitral valve contour system, which was the reduced FMR, was made on several factors, including one, being based in Victoria, Australia, having several prominent investors in Australia, including Mark Carnegie and Company, and Host Plus. The wide range of knowledge of Australian physicians in the space, and the high quality of specialised service providers such as Mobius, to take advantage of the tax incentive program offered in Australia. So the R&D tax rebate we took advantage of was, in my opinion, a straightforward process. with a large influence to base the study in Australia. Given the global nature and complexity of the study, we obtained an advanced finding from the Australian Tax Authority. And that's essentially a pre-review of the project by the Tax Office. It gives a level of assurance related to receiving the tax rebates, and it helps prevent any surprises down the track. In regards to annual filings, at the end of each financial year, we submit our accounts to the Australian Tax Office, and we receive the associated tax rebates of approximately 43 cents for every qualified dollar spent. So in the US, it's fair to say that tax programs are offered, but rarely are they as simple, straightforward, and as assured as the Australian tax rebate program. Subsequent to our experience within the program, I've personally recommended this to a dozen companies that are looking at running clinical trials and talking with Australian parent company like us. You simply need an operating company who is responsible for the study to be based in Australia. A couple of other things to note with the R&D tax rebate. Our study was a European and Australian study, which is one of the reasons we obtained the advanced finding. And given the nature of the medical device trials, the tax authority understands that there needs to be sites located outside of Australia and accommodates for those situations. They've had their accounts audited twice by tax authorities since participating in the program. Both times were straightforward and no changes were made. Overall, the incentive is a great program that allowed us to run an Australian-based study, tap into the Australian physicians to participate in this landmark trial, use great service providers like myself and KPMG, and run a study within a reasonable budget considering the tax rebates received. So if you're considering this program, from a Chief Operating Officer perspective, I would, 1, ensure you use a reputable service provider to navigate the tax incentives and the clinical work being performed in Australia. Keep great accounting records to ensure proper traceability of expenses related to your study. Talk with local investors like Carnegie and Hostplus, who are familiar with the process and interested in talking with companies who may be able to take advantage, just like they did. My third and final case study is Saluda, which is a closed-loop spinal neurostimulator device. Founded in 2013 by Professor John Parker, who was integral in the cochlear implant development also. Australia now has 50-something employees. In the US, we have 20 and 13 people in the European Union. Dan, I'd like to invite you to come up. Dan Brownstein is here from San Francisco. He's kindly come down to just, I don't know, give me some moral support and some kudos to you guys. He's the president of Saluda North America. Come on up, please. And Dan's going to talk to you about his experience, I suppose, of the Australian story so far and what's happening next. And we're going to be attached for a little while, but
cool.
Unless I import myself.
How's that? Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Suzanne. This is, I appreciate you inviting me down here. I've been working with Suzanne for now about 3 years, and there's a couple slides here. So our company is a spinal cord stimulator. That's what we're focusing on. We do neural stimulation across different areas. We're focusing on treating chronic pain. Spinal cord stimulation has been around for over 50 years, so it's nothing new. And but as we know, that the regulations have actually gotten more and more stringent in Europe and also in the U.S. So we've used Australia as our way to get into the European market and get our CE mark. So we're a little bit different because we're actually a Australian company, and I run the U.S. operations and I run the current U.S. IDE. But we've actually used the data in our original study to actually support our CE mark, and it's only Australian data. So we have 50 patients. We're currently in the middle of finalizing our CE mark, but the clinical data actually hasn't been an issue at all. So again, like it's not a novel in terms of the system itself. What's novel about it is it's a closed loop therapy, but 5 years ago, this would have been something that we would have gotten through on a first try without any clinical data. And I actually my last company we did use a similar concept and ran our study in Australia with just 10 patients. I think it was like 2 weeks of data, and we were able to get it through. This is a little bit different, and the world has changed. I also echo on the R&D tax incentive. We're now in the middle of our U.S. IDE study, and we've actually used the data that we had in Australia to inform the statistics and power our U.S. study. So we use that as a kind of the first step, and we had 2 years of data to help support that, and we're just in the middle of finalizing enrollment in that study. So the R&D tax credit from Australia actually can be used in the U.S. So all of our operations for research are we get 43.5 cents for all qualified dollars. So it's a fantastic investment for a startup company. Anything else?
There is one more slide just to show but
yeah. Yeah, so we originally did, we kind of went about it, before I got there, a bit backwards. We actually went to the US and did our IDE study here. It actually took over 2 years to enroll our study by the time we got through the FDA. And we actually had 37 patients at the end of that. And then within 12 months, we were able to enroll our first study in the US. And now we're in the middle of our EVOKE study and just in the middle of analyzing our data. So it's hopefully going to be a success story you can talk about next year. Very cool.
Cool, thanks. Sure. I might just grab that mic back just to do the last couple. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Okay, so just in closing, I don't know, what do you think? Is it worth the jet lag? It is a beautiful country. We have got a million things that can kill you, from crocodiles to great white sharks to spiders in your backyard that one bite and you're done. But we do also have 4 weeks to site activation, which is, I think, fairly astounding, I think, for a lot of countries, including the US. We have a straightforward protocol expansion system where we can go from very early feasibility, a couple of patients, through all the way to CE mark and to IDEs. It's inexpensive, obviously based on the dollar, but also that tax rebate of 43 cents in every dollar back for companies with a turnover of under 20 million. We know for a fact, because we have evidence, and Saluda is one of them, that wholly Australian data does support CE mark in Europe. Which obviously is a very positive move for all this new data that's needed for the new MDR. And we do have top quality investigators, globally renowned. There's a lot of key opinion leaders that come out of Australia. Okie dokie, that's it. Any questions? My details are here. You can grab me on Skype or on LinkedIn if you can't grab me on email.